started momentarily. Good afternoon and welcome to WITA. We are very pleased to have so many of you with us here today to discuss this very important issue at the nexus between international trade, human rights, and foreign policy. For WITA, international trade is about more than just the rules that govern economic activity between nations. It's also about the role that trade plays in relations between governments, businesses, workers, and society as a whole. In the coming months, we'll be exploring these interconnections, including at our third annual Washington International Trade Conference on February 8th and 9th, which will take place over Zoom this year. If you haven't already signed up for the conference, registration information can be found at www.wita.org. And in the program we sent around earlier today to those of you who are watching on Zoom. And for today only, if you can use the code WITA10, that's WITA10, one word, you can get 10% off ticket prices today only. Before we get to today's event, one of our favorite traditions is to call out some of the names of people you are in community with at today's event, even if you can't see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Bill Jackson at USTR, Catherine Mellor at UPS, Ambassador Susan Esserman at Steptoe, and Rita Cheng at Radio Free Asia. Welcome, Bill, Catherine, Susan, and Rita, and welcome to all of you. This is actually our second event looking at the issue of forced labor in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which I actually had the chance to visit in the mid-1990s when the Chinese were trying to demonstrate their peaceful coexistence with their westernmost citizens. Clearly, that has changed in recent years. Today, we'll hear from some of the leaders in raising alarm bells about the situation in Xinjiang and those trying to end the use of forced labor in China and around the world. We're pleased to welcome back to the WITA stage John Gold, Sharon Waxman, and Claude Fontheim, who've been with us before, either virtually or in person. And we're delighted to welcome to WITA for the first time Brenda Brockman Smith from the Office of Trade and at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and Dr. Adrian Zenz, who was one of the first researchers to document what is happening today in Xinjiang. Welcome, Brenda, John, Sharon, Adrian, and Claude. If you're watching this on Zoom, you should have all received their bios in the email we sent around this afternoon. You can also ask questions using the Q&A button on Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can in the latter part of the event. Thanks again for joining us today. And with that, I'll turn the program over to our moderator, Claude Fontheim, the Chief Executive Officer at Fontheim International and Chairman of the Labor and Human Rights NGOs Global Works Foundation and Goodweave International. Claude?
Ken, thanks so much. And thank you and Diego and the WITA team for putting together this terrific program. I'm delighted that we have such a terrific group of panelists, and I look forward to hearing from every single one of you. Each of you represent an important perspective on the challenge of crimes against humanity being perpetrated by the Chinese regime against Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minorities in Western China. I will introduce each of the speakers in just a couple words and then pose a question, and each of our speakers will discuss the issue for 4 or 5 minutes. And as Ken mentioned, later in the program, there'll be an opportunity for all of you attendees to pose questions. Our first panelist to speak is Dr. Adrian Zenz. Dr. Zenz is the Senior Fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Dr. Zenz, please explain a bit about your long history of research regarding human rights abuses targeting Uyghur and other Muslim ethnic minorities in and beyond Western China. And based on this research, please explain how you concluded that the Chinese authorities are committing a campaign of genocide against these minorities.
Well, thank you very much, Claude. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me on this panel. It's my privilege to be here. My own research started out with research on the Tibetans in Western China, looking at minority education, minority policy, and employment. And now this very quickly, with the mounting atrocity in Xinjiang, developed into a broader research effort into looking into government documents, particular and then not just Tibetan regions, but most recently, especially Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. My specialty is the analysis of government and other publicly accessible Chinese state and media documents, media reports, budgets, etc., in the context of the wider policy frameworks, which is very important for understanding, for example, the scale of an atrocity or the systematic nature of a particular policy. Now, the Xinjiang Autonomous Region was established in 1949. Mao Zedong invaded Xinjiang with his armies. And since then, the Uyghurs have been subject to various forms of discrimination, very severe ones during the Cultural Revolution. So there's a lot of history here. But of course, China's entire approach to ethnic policy really came to a head in 2008 and 2009 with the rioting in Lhasa, the Tibetans, and in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. Now, it became clear that China's ethnic minority policy approach had failed, which had tried to promote top-down economic development with some trickle-down effects. But then especially with Xi Jinping, and after Xi Jinping's visit to the region in Xinjiang 2014, the entire approach changed significantly to a much more intrusive form of micromanaging every single individual. So you no longer just trust that general market forces might lead to ethnic minorities choosing to learn Chinese or abandon religion or abandon their culture over time. But it's really now about having a file, digital files, where every single citizen is in it and what they do and what their living is. And this, of course, connects to the topic of forced labor. Now, Xinjiang set up a massive police state with police stations, surveillance systems, controlling people, which was like a first step. This was followed by a huge campaign of mass internment into re-education camps, designed scooping up as much as 10 to 20, in some regions 30% of the entire adult population, especially taking out religious figures, intellectual figures, heads of households, men, leaders, educated people, putting them in prison, putting others in re-education camps, breaking people. It's about breaking people. This is really unprecedented. It's worse than the Cultural Revolution. It's almost worse than anything we've witnessed, almost unless the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the last time we had such a large incarceration of a targeted ethno-religious minority. But the difference is Hitler was creating death camps. What is Beijing doing? Beijing is not trying to engage in mass murder or mass killing. It's engaging in the mass molding, breaking, re-engineering, and assimilating an entire ethnic group to control them and make them like the Han Chinese. To this end, once people come out of internment camps, the long-term next step is the separation of parents and children through boarding schools and forced labor. Forced labor plays a big role. Making people pick cotton is part of this. Transferring them to other parts of China is part of this. Parent-child separation and the breaking apart of families and communities is an intentional aspect that's even more important than the economic gain that Beijing is getting from this. This is about the assimilation, the breaking apart of natural family entities, cultural bonds, etc. Satellite factories are being constructed in villages. They have nurseries for tiny children, babies, who are too young for preschools. Adults are being transferred to factory, industrial parks and factory compounds, which are entire settings with dormitories, with preschools, with boarding schools, with entertainment, everything, except nothing religious, right? Nothing cultural. So why is this? What is it? It's, some people have called this a slow burning genocide, not a fast one, a slow one. It's about the destruction of people. It's also been referred to as ethnocide. Pompeo's genocide appraisal, which was issued recently, was heavily based not just on the crimes against humanity, but especially on the aspect of messing with the physical population growth, setting population growth targets and achieving them through sterilization, intrauterine contraceptive devices, mass birth prevention, abortions, etc. As soon as you mess with the physical population, you're talking physical, you tick a box in the United Nations Convention of actual genocide. Now, this is a bipartisan appraisal, and actually a major part of the slow genocide is forced labor. Anthony Blinken, who is now the Secretary of State, expressed this very well, that for him the notion of genocide was expressed in all the different facets of the atrocity, from religious oppression to internment camps to forced labor to sterilization. Beijing is turning the business of oppression, is turning the situation into a business scheme, because the police state is expensive and the cost of labor in Eastern China has risen significantly. So Uyghur labor is comparatively cheap. This is an important aspect of this. But the number one goal of the state is long-term assimilation of a very difficult ethnic minority, a bit like the Tibetans, and some parts of this component, especially the forced labor transfer, actually is being implemented with the Tibetans now. Thank you. We can't hear you. You're on mute.
Isn't that the story of our lives these days? How many times have we heard you're on mute? I mean, it seems I hear that 5 times a day. Dr. Zenz, thank you for that compelling and concise presentation. I hope that all of our other panelists take a cue from you in being equally concise and to the point. Our next speaker, our next panelist is Brenda Brockman Smith. Ms. Smith is Executive Assistant Commissioner in the Office of Trade, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, commonly referred to as CBP. Ms. Smith, please discuss recent actions taken by CBP to halt imports of products containing forced labor inputs to the United States. It would be helpful to provide some insights into CBP's recent enforcement actions, as well as your approach to enforcement going forward. And in addition to all that, it would be wonderful if you could provide a little insight into the scope of CBP's enforcement authority under the law.
Claude, thanks so much for including me in today's panel. It's great to have the opportunity to provide an overview of the landscape with so many distinguished colleagues, but also to help amplify the message around what CBP is actually doing versus what it's not. And I think, Claude, the point that the last question that you asked, kind of what is the basis for CBP's actions, is probably the place I'd like to start. We, in the 1930s, actually, the Congress passed the Tariff Act and gave, at that point, the U.S. Customs Service the authority to exclude goods, actually mandated the exclusion of goods made wholly or in part with forced labor. At that point, it was an economic issue to ensure that U.S. domestic businesses were able to compete against other manufacturers, for example, that may have very cheap labor costs used through unfair labor practice. Fast forward to 2016, when the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act was passed, which really raised the profile of CBP's authority and really allowed stakeholders to work with CBP, not only to educate the government around this issue, particularly in customs and border protection, but also to provide education for us, information for us, and help us sort through the best way to get our arms around a very egregious practice. What we found is there's already a lot of good work being done across the US government, the Department of State, the Department of Labor, as well as a number of our trade policy partners that are focused on making sure that there is a fair platform for labor practices and trade. Over the last couple of years, we've learned a tremendous amount. And we've also developed very strong relationships with a lot of the non-governmental community, the international labor community, as well as with our partners across the US government. We've also shifted from a reactive mode where we just take information in or take allegations in about forced labor to a more self-initiated approach. And about 2 years ago, we began to really become much more aware of the high risk of the use of forced labor in the Xinjiang autonomous region. And so began to start to gather evidence and build a case that would support reasonable but not conclusive, and that's the legal standard we have to meet, to issue what's known as a withhold release order, which allows us to detain goods that we believe may be made with forced labor at our ports of entry. Those withhold release orders, or WROs as we call them, also are a message to the private sector that we believe there's significant risk here. We did issue our first Xinjiang related withhold release order at in September of 2019. We've done a number of actions focused on the economic infrastructure, be they vocational camps or detention re-education camps, industrial parks that house manufacturers that are organized to use the labor from detention camps, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, or XPCC, and then most recently on January 14th, the regional order on cotton and tomato products being produced in Xinjiang. It will be a challenge to enforce that order because of the breadth of the use of Xinjiang cotton. We are committed to taking a scalpel approach and are looking and continuing to gather information and ensure that our targeting is focused on the highest risk. So Claude, I'll stop there. Claude, I think you're still on.
Claude, you're muted again.
Sorry, Ken, you'll probably have to remind me every time about that. Sorry. I can see we have a panel that is not only expert in the subject matter, but able to present a big and complex issues in a very concise manner, which is fantastic. Our next panelist is Sharon Waxman, the president and CEO of the Fair Labor Association. Sharon, the FLA has been working on the persecution of Uyghur and other Muslim minorities in China for some time now. Could you please share a few words, first of all, about the FLA itself, and then your approach to the crisis, particularly as it became clear that Chinese authorities were committing crimes against humanity involving the supply chains of some FLA members. Most recently, you took the very important step of banning all sourcing from Xinjiang by FLA members. What are the steps that led to this ban and the earlier steps taken by the FLA to confront this crisis?
Thanks, Claude, for the question, and thanks to Ken and WITA for organizing this panel discussion and for including fair labor, at the table. I want to just start by addressing the first part of your question, Claude, which is, who is the Fair Labor Association? What are we and what are we not? So what we are is a human rights non-governmental organization that's comprised of civil society, businesses, and universities. Despite having the name association in our name, we're not a trade association. We're operational. We have work with some of the biggest brands that you've heard of. Companies like Adidas and Nike and Patagonia and Uniqlo, Nestle, and on the civil society side, we have many upstanding members of the NGO community, ranging from Oxfam to Goodweave to unions in Turkey and Bangladesh. So we really and universities, some of whom I believe are on this call, UCLA and 200 other universities. So we bring together lots of different perspectives in an operational way to help set standards based on international laws and norms, and work with companies to embed those standards in their corporate governance and execute across their manufacturing facilities in the supply chain. And our role is to help set the standard and to evaluate performance against the standard. We work mostly in manufacturing and agriculture, but our standards and tools and approaches, I mean, particularly as it relates to Xinjiang and forced labor, can really be applied to any sector. So the last 2 years in the FLA, I think much like at CBP, have really, we've been engaged in kind of a mental journey and a reimagining of our relationship with efforts in Xinjiang. I think information has been, 2 years ago, information started to become much more publicly available thanks to the great work of researchers like Adrian and others about reports of internment camps. And the conversation, a couple of years ago was focused mostly on managing risk. So fast forward, to now where the conversation with the last administration and as Adrian mentioned, even with the incoming administration with Secretary Blinken, stating very clearly that what's happening in Xinjiang is genocide. They're saying that it's genocide. So, it's a really big evolution from a camp and a cloudy, question about, what's going on there? How do we manage our risks? To really embracing the conclusion and changing our thinking. We concluded, 2 years ago that the situation in Xinjiang is not one in which normal due diligence can be conducted. Audits are really not possible in a part of the country where there's enormous government control. Worker interviews, which are an incredibly important part of any assessment process, are not possible. No worker can speak freely, and if they do, they clearly fear that they will that there will be retaliation. Their families will be harmed, and then people are being put in internment camps. So our mental evolution has gone from, you can't really, don't do audits, to, last March, it's time to look for new areas for sourcing, to a decision by the board in December to ban all sourcing, directly or indirectly from Xinjiang. For us as a multi-stakeholder organization, that was a really big decision. It's the first time in the organization's 20-year history where the board said, we are just blocking off this area and saying that business needs to really change its operations. So that was our evolution, and it's just really been a complete change in mindset.
Sharon, thanks so much. I decided not to mute myself this time so that I wouldn't have the same problem. That is a really fantastic summary of the role that FLA has played and sort of how you went about this very complex process. Our next panelist, last but not least, is my friend John Gold. John is the vice president for supply chain and customs policy at the National Retail Federation. John, as a representative of the retail industry, could you please discuss the industry's response to China's human rights abuses targeting Uyghur and other Muslim ethnic minorities? China plays a major role in global apparel and other supply chains. And as it became clear that the Chinese authorities were committing crimes against humanity, and more recently, as the US government has issued warnings and WROs, as Brenda discussed, how has the industry responded along the way? Will the industry be doing more going forward? And what should the government be doing to address this crisis beyond the good work of the CBP through diplomacy and other means to take on this crisis?
Great, Claude, thank you for the question. I'm going to try and keep my comments pretty concise so we can get into more of a discussion here. But again, thank you for the question. I want to thank, like Sharon and the others, thank Ken and WITA for the opportunity to participate in today's panel discussion. It's an incredibly important issue, and I'm glad WITA is dedicating time to it, and I look forward to further discussions about this, because this certainly should not be the last panel discussion that we have on this issue. As for your question, retailers do not tolerate forced labor within their supply chains, period. Retailers and brands have a number of protocols in place to identify and immediately address any issues of forced labor if it is suspected in their supply chains. The situation in Xinjiang is horrific and something that the industry is taking very seriously. We've been working together with our partner associations encompassing all major sectors of the industry for over a year with retailers and brands to ensure that our members are fully educated and to partner with others to identify new and innovative approaches to ensure supply chain integrity. Companies have actively engaged all tiers in their supply chains to identify and address any issues of forced labor. The challenges remain, especially as you go deeper in the supply chain where there is no direct contractual relationship with the parties. And I think, in talking with Brenda and others, the complexities of the supply chain is incredibly difficult, but companies are trying to work their way through that as best they can. And this is where partnerships are essentially critical to identify that. As Sharon noted, we know that some of the traditional auditing programs are challenging in the region. As a result, the industry continues to investigate and accelerate innovative approaches and use technology to determine where supply chains are susceptible to forced labor. This is, again, where partnerships are critical with all stakeholders to further develop these efforts. We continue to applaud and work and the attention that both the current and former administration and Congress have placed on this issue. We think more can and should be done. We've continued to call upon the U.S. government to lead in cooperation with like-minded countries, the U.S. business community, and other key stakeholders in developing and implementing a holistic, transparent, and enforceable approach to enforce labor in China, as well as a larger campaign of oppression that it fuels. Others have made similar calls for U.S. leadership to address this issue. Business certainly plays a critical role, but we cannot solve this crisis alone. We look forward to continuing to work with the administration, Congress, NGOs, and other stakeholders to ensure that additional efforts seek to build upon actions that have already been taken. However, we need to make sure that such efforts provide all stakeholders clear, effective, and enforceable path forward to reaching our shared goal of ending forced labor in Xinjiang. And happy to have further conversation, but I think as a whole, industry understands the situation and is trying to do what they can within their supply chains. I think the good work that Sharon has been doing with FLA and other NGOs, relying on work that Adrian has done for the learnings, it's all important work that's being done, and we want to continue that effort. But again, this has to be done through a collaborative effort to address the root cause and solve the issue of forced labor.
John, thanks so much for that. And I'd now like to turn to a conversation among the panelists. Everybody was so focused, concise, and disciplined about their comments that we now have a bit of time for that conversation. Let me ask the panelists to raise any questions that you all have that you'd like your fellow panelists to address. And let me just throw one sort of conversation starter out there, which is that as somebody who has followed these events fairly closely, for quite a while, the focus was on almost exclusively on forced labor, and there's a good reason for that. That is the piece of the crisis that is most directly addressed by U.S. law and which CBP is empowered to enforce. I think there's now a growing understanding, thanks to the work of Dr. Zenz and others, that this is part of a broader campaign that intended to eliminate an entire ethnic group from the earth, and through means that are extraordinarily intrusive and brutal. I'd love to hear thoughts on what can be done to take on the larger problem, and including things that are beyond the ability of business and industry to do. So I just throw that out there for comment, but please feel free to pose any other issues or questions. Do I have a volunteer to Sharon and then Brenda? Wow, this is awesome.
Well, I'll defer to Brenda.
All right, I'll start and then maybe build on, Sharon.
Okay.
All right, so Claude, I think great question. And I think one of the things that we have really recognized, and Adrian brought it out beautifully in his opening remarks, is that this situation we haven't seen in a long time. As CBP has issued release orders on different products and in different parts of the world, I think what we generally find is a situation of forced labor that is, I'll say, backed into. It is not a government strategy to enslave people and put them to work, by and large. In this instance, the government is very clearly involved, which brings from a government perspective, from a US government perspective, the need really to understand not only the economics and the labor issues related, but the trade and foreign policy issues. And I think when we saw the 4 departments working together over the summer to issue the supply chain business advisory in July, you really saw that the US government recognizes that this needs to be an integrated approach and that there are a number of authorities and actions that need to be taken around this issue of forced labor in Xinjiang. And so I would look for the government, recognizing the extent of the problem, giving them a little bit of time to get their arms around some of the other pressing issues, to start to look at this from a holistic perspective.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful.
Yeah, and I'll just build on that and say that in terms of the way this has unfolded, this is it's a policy decision by the Chinese government toward this region. So the ultimate solution to your question, Claude, is for the Chinese government to be persuaded to change its policy. I think that's where diplomacy comes in. That's where economic pressure comes in. That's where the international community comes in a conversation with the Chinese government. I hope we'll see a lot of that from the incoming administration. That said, and U.S. government policy is clearly not changing on this issue, as we've talked about before. The State Department, is very clear in saying this is genocide. So, that said, I don't see the Chinese government changing its view and position on this issue anytime soon. So, what that means is that I think for all of us, this is not an issue we can wish away. I would also say that, the focus has initially and largely been on the apparel sector, given the cotton inputs and, I think it's really important as part of this conversation and all conversations to recognize that all industries with operations in China, even if they don't source from Xinjiang, can be inadvertently complicit in these human rights abuses in Xinjiang. I mean, no company wants to be involved in, this. The supply chains are enormously complicated. But I think for business, it would be a mistake to focus only on the apparel sector or now on tomatoes. This is really an issue for the entire business community. And I think it's an issue where business needs to change its mindset very quickly. Again, we're talking about genocide. So if any business is sourcing raw material from Xinjiang, I think this is the time to develop a strategy to change those operations. If a business doesn't know its supply chain, they need to start tracing it and do it tomorrow or today. If you don't have the relationships, I mean, John points out or makes a really good point that a lot of this, relationships, once you get deeper into the supply chain, are non-existent or complicated. If you don't have the relationships, you need to develop them. And, by all means, don't start investing in Xinjiang right now. This is clearly no business, again, as I said before, no business wants to be involved in this. There is an enormous legal component that Brenda's talked about that I think a lot of businesses are focusing on. Consumers obviously care about this, but fundamentally it's a moral issue. I've not seen human rights abuses like this, in my career. I think we need to really change the mindset and think about this in a more intentional and deeper way across industry.
Yeah, Claude, if I could just add to what both Sharon and Brenda said, I think that, the integrated government approach is definitely where we need to go, but it needs to be more than just the U.S. that is working on this. We've have to have an international community approach to seek to address this issue, and the U.S. has to lead on that. And our hope is that the new administration will certainly pick that up and will lead those efforts. Working with our allies, which I know many within the administration, the nominees for the posts and President Biden have all said themselves, the need to work through a lot of these issues is with our allies and partners. And I think that's the only way you're really going to put that pressure on China to make that change, which is needed. Again, as I noted, industry alone can't change this. NGOs alone can't change this. We need the force of everybody behind us working together to address the atrocities that we're seeing within Xinjiang. And I think as companies are making their business decisions and obviously doing what they can to identify all the parties within their supply chain, enforce their what's in their contracts as far as not using forced labor, trying to dig in as best they can. Developing those new technologies for tracing is critically important. I know CBP is taking a look at some of those technologies. Doing partnerships and pilot programs to really identify that is going to be critical because it's not easy to do right now, but companies are trying to do as best they can. So to get further support to help those innovative efforts to try and do this, I think is incredibly important. But again, this has to be a global come together effort to really go after the issue in China. And we hope that, labeling the genocide by Secretary Pompeo before he left to pick up with this administration will really help push that going further.
I think
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, Adrian. I think you've laid out a great vision, but I think to Sharon's point about getting the message across to the Chinese government, I mean, the power of our economics really, I think, has to be put behind this issue. And whether that means making the economic decision to stop buying, stop sourcing, stop manufacturing, our message to consumers has been, as well as the business community, is you've got to know your supply chain. And we're encouraging consumers to ask, what's the supply chain visibility? What's the transparency? What actions are companies taking to ensure that their supply chains are clean? And I think particularly in this instance where it's going to be an uphill battle, that we've got to deliver the message using every tool that we can.
Before you jump in, because I just want to respond to something Brenda just said real quick as far as that the shift to sourcing. I think companies are looking at making that shift, But there are challenges with how quickly companies can make that shift. And there are, to be honest, trade policies that prevent us from making that shift. I think if you can provide, the US government can provide more carrots for, especially on apparel trade, to have companies make some of those shifts to other markets, companies would be willing to do that. But the scale and the scope of, unfortunately, what we see out of China, it's not as easy as people think it is. I mean, you can't shift everything back to the United States or other countries. But I think working through some of the trade policy initiatives to provide more incentives for that shift as well is going to help in the long run too. Sorry, Adrian, go ahead.
No, that's all very good. My question was really very generally to Brenda about what is, and maybe you have hinted at this, but what is, CBP has a huge job. I mean, the US government, the past administration, followed the entirety of my recommendations, basically, on cotton at least. Okay, the Forced Labor Prevention Act would ban all products from Xinjiang, but now we got cotton with a very wide wording, and as far as I understood, at least from Reuters, it applies to any products processed or in part or in whole in other countries made with any Xinjiang cotton as well. So this is a huge task, and we've talked about almost preventative, about raising awareness, about companies now have a job to even understand the supply chains. But what is CBP's strategy to approach this huge new development?
It's a big challenge, Adrian, and thanks for really getting right to the core of the matter for CBP. So we have a very broad mandate to exclude goods and forced labor. And as you note, and Reuters and a number of other outlets have done some tremendous reporting on translating our fairly legal enforcement action into what this really means. Our estimates, our data indicates that 85% of the cotton grown by China, which is not the only global cotton producer, comes out of the Xinjiang region. And the manufacturing process involves a lot of mixing of cotton from Xinjiang with other parts of with other cotton grown in the rest of China, along with cotton grown in many other places like the US and India. So the challenge for us and for many private sector entities is how do we specifically identify the goods that have Xinjiang cotton in them. And if you just go by probability, I think many garments coming from China are likely to have this. So CBP will apply its standard enforcement approach, which is to focus on the highest risk. So where there is a direct business connection, we have been tracing supply chains that have business relationships with entities located in Xinjiang. We have been working to look at where there is high volume coming out and talking to those business entities where we have significant imports headed to the United States. We recognize that there is a lot of cotton leaving China, going to a third country for processing into a finished garment. That they are also on the list, but in terms of the level of risk, we're going to start with our links directly to Xinjiang first.
Brenda and Adrian, thank you very much. And all four of you have made just incredibly insightful comments about the challenge and some of the solutions. And obviously, Brenda, CBP has a central role to play in this endeavor, and I think that's going to continue. I mean, that's your agency is going to continue to play an absolutely central role in taking that on. But before turning this over to Ken, who will manage the Q&A, I'd just like to say that for those of you in business who are watching, I think we're just at the very front end of assessing what this means for America's relationship with China and what this means for business. Now that there are clear findings of the pervasiveness of forced labor and the consequent the WROs that have resulted from that. Business, I think, has got to think very carefully about the shift in the very nature of the Chinese political system, in which the long-time foundation of the Chinese Communist Party's claim to legitimacy is changing. Historically, it's been mostly about, population, you guys stay out of politics, defer to the party, and we will deliver economic growth and poverty reduction. So stay out of politics, don't challenge the primacy of the party, and we'll leave you alone and deliver a better life. The shift, that's certainly still part of the claim of the leadership to legitimacy, but now there is also an ethno-nationalist foundation for it. And that ethnicity is Han Chinese. The consequence of that is we're seeing, sadly, in Xinjiang. And over time, people will ask, where were you when? What were you doing when mass rape was used to put down Uyghurs? Where were you when their children were taken away to be indoctrinated? Where were you when they were forced into slave labor? Where were you when this massive persecution took place that has been recognized officially by the US government as genocide? I think that has enormous implications, and we've only begun to think about what that means. Now, the Biden administration, pardon?
Thank you, Claude.
The Biden administration seems to be headed on a good course in addressing that, and some of the elements that I think John Gold, you mentioned, to employ diplomacy and our alliances with other democracies to take this on. But the implications, I think, are enormous. And Ken, I hope that WITA does more work on this topic, because
thank you, Claude.
The implications to US-China relations, I think, are enormous.
We appreciate your enthusiasm for addressing these issues. This is our second event on this topic in just 3 months, so we are definitely focused on it. We have a lot of questions that have come in. We're not going to get to all of them, unfortunately. We've been in touch with several folks at CBP. There's a lot of questions in here in the queue that deal with sort of technical aspects of how CBP is going to enforce. We will forward those questions directly with folks who have questions. We do have several questions that kind of cross over a few people having to do with transshipment. Brenda addressed some of the issues about cotton within China, and assuming that most cotton products coming out of China probably use Xinjiang cotton. But what do we do about the issue related to Chinese cotton getting into products that are manufactured outside of China? Both, how is business, John, dealing with that issue? Brenda, how are you monitoring those sorts of issues?
Ken, I think, coming back again to it's the mapping of the supply chain and trying to identify, where everything comes from that's going into the product. As I noted, unfortunately, there's not a lot of, a lot of folks don't have that full visibility back to where, the cotton is farmed, but companies are, working through that. And this is where some of the tracing technologies will come into play to help identify that. And again, I think there's opportunity there, but I think that's an issue that I think everybody is grappling with and trying to identify and figure out how, again, from Brenda's perspective, how CBP and the government are going to target and enforce from that perspective. I think there's a lot of questions there, but it certainly is a question that companies have identified and are trying to identify how best to do that track and trace all the way back to identify where the cotton is coming from and how it's being used.
And I think from our perspective, we welcome efforts, but as most importers recognize, the Customs Modernization Act, which was passed in 1993, established the concept of reasonable care and the expectation that U.S. importers will know their supply chains. We recognize the challenge that knowing your supply chain back through 3 or 4 tiers of that of your supply chain is difficult. But we also know that, for example, the Chinese government tracks cotton at the bale level. And so while there's a tremendous amount of challenge around finding the information, the expectation is that if you dig enough or you ask enough questions, the information should be available to you. Frankly, we've had to switch over the last 5 years from taking a strictly legal approach to looking at supply chains to using our regulatory audit capability to look at books and records and use analytics to do supply chain tracing. And so it does take an investment, but I think that the level that we're talking about and the connection to forced labor really means we need to do extra due diligence.
Thank you, Brenda. The next question I'm going to toss out there, it's sort of a geopolitical question that cuts across several of you. There are about 3 questions that are asked the same thing in a different way, but I'm going to read the one that came in from Yanis Lazda, who some of you folks know from Target. I'll read the question. We talk a lot about allies and economic pressure, but let's look at who our allies really are. With the exception of the UK, Canada, and a few others, reaction has been tepid, despite widespread evidence. And the EU just completed an investment agreement with China, which has generated some controversy. The European Parliament has called for sanctions, but the Commission hasn't done anything and appears to be solidifying ties with China. How do we change that? And Adrian, I might go to you too. How has your report been received, your work in Europe? And we know that the Chinese have tried to censor your work, and I've seen some of the Chinese trolls coming after you. But how do we work with others? I know this is something Sharon and Brenda with your compatriots as well.
It's interesting. Of course, my report on cotton was actually published entirely through European media outlets, BBC, Germany, and French newspapers. And it came very well timed. It led to a European Parliament resolution on Xinjiang that contained a lot on forced labor on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and other places. And we just see the huge discrepancy between a European Commission who is unaccountable, bureaucrats, who has the authority to negotiate external trade agreements driven by core industry interest and traditionally very little to no regard to human rights. Even cynical remarks by Mr. Wuttke from the trade side about, oh, do we want to have a better trade deal, or do we want to feel good and do human rights? Which I feel this is just a horrible remark, really. And then you have the European Parliament. We have elected parliamentarians, and many of them care very much about human rights. And they're the ones who overwhelmingly approved the resolution, which included my findings on cotton and other forced labor and other findings. So, and now in the UK, which has split off, you have a growing anti-China discourse that you don't have the same way in continental Europe. So we got a very complex situation. The problem is Germany dominates the European consensus, and Germany has traditionally had a foreign policy with a heavy focus on trade and trying to stay out of either anything political or even human rights. And that's an approach that with China is running into manifest national security risk. So my argument, and one thing I try to say, is that the human rights situation, including in Xinjiang, including in Hong Kong, has to be pulled out of the human rights corner. We are talking What China is doing is actually a risk to the national security of our democracies, because this has wider implications, and one aspect of that is forced labor. So we have to rescue the whole thing from the human rights box. And in the US, you have the legal side, thanks to the CBP, that there even is a CBP, that there now is the ban on cotton. In many European contexts, you don't have this. The European Parliament is trying to introduce a resolution on supply chain tracing. Germany is the same. These are all still in the exception. They're still being debated. Nothing exists. So the US does not have a strong ally in continental Europe at the moment.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on working cooperatively with our allies on these issues? Sharon, are you any of your groups? You work internationally, and Brenda, maybe it looks like you unmuted. Did you have something to add about working with your compatriots?
So we've had a lot of interest from other customs administrations. At this point, the US is the only one with the customs authority to exclude goods made with forced labor. But in the USMCA agreement, that the expectation about exclusion of forced labor goods was also extended to Canada and Mexico. And they've been very proactive in terms of trying to understand what that means for them, what they can do. We've had similar conversations with other international counterparts. We've learned about things like the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australia Modern Slavery Act, looking to see, can that help? Does that have pieces and parts that could be useful in the strategy? But I would say that we are helping to move the conversation into what tools are available to us other than just talking.
Thank you. We're right about on the hour to wrap up. Sharon, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of end where we started, which is that, this is an issue that, the magnitude of the abuses that we're seeing in Xinjiang are unlike anything I think most of us have seen anywhere in recent memory. And, again, there is the legal component, there is, the customer, component, but ultimately, I think business really needs to ask itself, does it want to be involved in these kinds of egregious human rights abuses? I think the answer is no. The challenge is to figure out how to disentangle from it. Clearly there is a role for business, there is a role for government, there's a role for civil society. I don't think it's, one versus the other. It's, if you think of it as a multiple choice exam, it's all of the above. And that we don't have the luxury of not doing anything. We don't have the luxury of waiting for a diplomatic breakthrough. And we all just need to, to move forward. And again, recognize that this is not only about cotton. It's electronics, it's, it's everything.
Thanks. Any other final words? Claude, you want to wrap us up?
Thanks, Ken. Ken, again, thanks to you, Diego, and all of these fantastic panelists. There's very little to add other than this is going to take time. The business community is not going to be able to pivot on a dime in implementing change. U.S. government will take a lot of time to mobilize an international coalition behind this. The Europeans clearly decided that, given the last 4 years, they need to hedge their relationship with the United States by upgrading their relationship with China, and civil society, I think, needs to do more as well and really think about its strategies. So this is a long haul. The only thing I would add is that, since John pointed out that there are limits to what business can do through its own supply chain management. So One thing that business might consider is advocacy. The U.S. government probably needs to have a whole of government approach in taking this on. And if business doesn't want to be the sole party responsible, consider advocacy to the government to do more and to provide more carrots, to diversify sourcing to places like Haiti, Sub-Saharan Africa, maybe soon Uzbekistan if their problems are dealt with, and other places that can absorb cotton production, apparel production, and also manufacturing, as Sharon said, of all kinds of other products, consumer products, electronics, etc. So, yeah, but Ken, this has been awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. Special thanks, Dr. Zenz, for the work you have done in raising awareness of this issue, which I think was I wouldn't even say back burner. It wasn't even on the stove before the research came out. And obviously the Chinese are doing what they can to keep as much information away from the rest of the world about what they're doing in Xinjiang. So thank you for your work. Sharon, the great work you are doing. Thank you very much. And all your team at FLA. Brenda, thank you for all the good work of the people of Customs. You have a big challenge ahead on this and so many other matters. John, thank you for everything that you're doing, trying to lead the way, and Claude, and all the work you've done for many, many years working on the nexus of human rights, labor rights, and business and trade. Thank you all very much for joining us. As I say at the end of all these sessions, everybody, please take care of yourselves, wear a mask, and get the shot when you're eligible.